皆様、こんにちは。インテグリティスマタースバイ単位トゥインです。本日はオーストラリア・メルボルンのデイキン大学にてデジタルラーニングディレクターとして従事される足立先生をお招きし、デジタル社会における教育と学習、ポストコロナの教訓についてお話しいただきます。なお、インタビューは英語での実施となります。では、本日のホストをご紹介させていただきます。インテグリティーズマターズ、弊社、単位トゥインにて、ソートリーダーの、ポジションを従事しております、チャックが、左上に、おります。で、足立先生、今ご紹介いたしました、メルボルン、オーストラリアのメルボルンのディーキン大学の、足立千恵先生を、いらっしゃいます。よろしくお願いいたします。
よろしくお願いします。
足立先生、早速ですけども、ご自身について、簡単にご紹介いただけますでしょうか。
そうですね。簡単にご紹介させていただきたいと思いますけども、やっぱり長い話なんで、短いバージョンの話をしたいと思います。日本でほとんど学歴をしたんですね。なので、学部と修士を教育学で、熊本大学でしたんですけども、そこから人生変わることがあって、エディンバラ大学に行って博士をすることになりました。で、その博士は、linguistics、言語学で博士を取ったんですけども、そこからまた教育学に帰ってくるということになって、10年前にオーストラリアに来たんですけれども、そこからまた教育学に興味を持って、今、ディーケン大学での、Learning Teaching Unit で、言われている Deakin Learning Futures というところで働いていまして、デジタルエデュケーションに関する仕事をしております。というのも、大学でいろいろな Digital Learning Innovation Projects がありますので、それに関わる仕事をやらせてもらっています。
はい。ありがとうございます。
I think it's over to me. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Trinity. My name is Chooks. I'll be your host for today. Today, we've got Dr. Chie in the house, and we're going to be looking at teaching and learning in a digital world and try to address some lessons learned post-COVID. I know the pandemic is still going on for some people in some other countries. We're looking at the context after the first wave of COVID. Can we meet you, Dr. Chie? Tell us a bit about yourself, your research background, and your role as Director of Digital Learning at Deakin University.
Thanks, Chuck. Lovely to be here. And it is a long story, like many others, perhaps working in higher education. So I'll give you 2 minutes version of that if I can. So I've always had strong interest and passion, I think, for language and education. I've done most of my formal education back in Japan with bachelor and masters of education, wanting to be an English teacher there. And obviously something has gone wrong, and I decided to do a PhD in linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. And then through teaching in linguistics courses, I've made my way back to education. And so now I'm in a fortunate position to work on all things digital education at Deakin University. And I suppose among many hats that we all wear at work, there are 2 important hats to note here. So one, as myself as a teacher and researcher. And so I'm the course director for our grad cert and masters of digital learning leadership courses at Deakin, and I teach into these degree courses and do research in and around digital education. And the other hat that I wear is the director digital learning for the university, working within the Deputy Vice Chancellor education portfolio. So I manage a team of academic developers, learning designers, and learning technologists to drive the initiatives around digital learning and teaching. So we work on a number of digital learning innovation projects while also managing the entire digital learning environments, including our LMS.
Excellent. Really good to meet you. And just for those watching, I've been a huge fan of Chi Adachi. Been to some of the sessions at Deakin, and yeah, I must say that for learning designers like myself, those have been really good sessions. I think it's the best angle to begin this conversation is to get a sense of how you describe digital learning and how has teaching and learning changed prior to after the first wave of COVID. I'm not going to say post-COVID because I know we just realized that COVID is still happening in some areas of the world. So it will be selfish to say post-COVID. So how has teaching and learning changed post second wave of COVID in Australia?
No, really good question. And first of all, thank you for that lovely comment. That's really kind of you to say that. And I think there are two parts to that question, isn't there? So firstly, how do I define or describe digital learning? I generally follow the school of thoughts on networked learning proposed by Peter Gugia and colleagues. And so for me, digital learning is all about connection and experiences that are otherwise impossible for learning to emerge without that use of digital. And then the other part is, how has learning and teaching changed post-COVID? Well, as you just said, Chuck, I think we are still living with COVID, and now we are seeing more of the impacts and changes that happened due to the COVID pivot last year. So compared to the initial reaction to simply moving and transitioning our teaching practices to online, there has been much more focus on reimagining the learning and teaching practices. So the quest for a new model of blended learning, if you like, that reflects our recent experiences very strong. And so we're not wanting to just go back to the ways things were with digital education. The focus is now finding our clever ways of blending online and on-campus experiences with the level of flexibility students both want and need. And we're still very much in that fluid space where the regulations around social distancing and the capacity on campus are changing. In Victoria, it's selling in a lot more now, and we can now have more students back on campus. But this idea of what balance do we need to strike in terms of offering the best learning experiences with the combining of the online and on-campus experience is really big. So a couple of examples, if you like, that are happening at Deakin. And these are not new ideas. And I think in many ways, people always wanted to do this, but now this is our chance to really bring that transformation together. One is about less didactic lectures. So focus on active interactions in class. When we do bring students back on campus, we want to harness that time to be doing really active learning, less didactic lectures. And then that translates into the online space. We don't want to do 3 hours of Zoom talking at students, but more engaging and interactive learning to happen. So that's one side of the story. The other one that we see really important, and a lot of universities are reacting to this, is that rethinking exam. How do we make more authentic and better assessments for end of trimester assessment? So again, we don't want to just make all the traditional exams to be invigilated or proctored and timed and high stake online. So we don't want to just do that online the way that we used to do on campus, but how can we make sure to assure the quality of learning and the learning outcomes in an exam context online? So these are the kind of two examples that really changing the space in the space of post or living with COVID, I think.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a new term we're going to do, living with COVID, because it seems to be driving or dragging longer than we anticipated. You've mentioned blended learning, and my next question is around examining pedagogical practices. Are there new pedagogical approaches that might change the way we teach And you already talked a bit more, but let's explore that as current practice.
Yeah, another good question. And I think it's important to pause and think about this. I've always said this, but good teaching is good teaching, online or offline. So the principles, for example, around active learning still stand in remote and hybrid learning, but it's that application that changes in context. So how do these principles get enacted might be different from one course and context to another. And the kinds of learner cohorts and demographics of the students you have might also impact on this as well. But I think one thing that's come through clearly through these various studies and evaluations that have been done on online learning experience last year, including something like the National Students Experience Survey, is that the notion of engagement and interaction is really important. And students have those engagement and interaction with teachers, peers, university, and importantly, interface in a digital space or digital learning environment. So we're paying more attention to that. And for obvious reasons, when our physical interactions that we used to have were restricted, students miss those in the way that learning happened for them in online all of a sudden. And we saw this most strikingly in the first year students cohort. Because if you can remember or imagine what would happen in the first year students of study, they're using a lot of interactions and engagement on campus, in the corridor, between lectures, asking, what does that mean? How can I do this? Where can I find that? And so all that interactions and engagement were restricted as we moved to online space, of course. So we had to think carefully about how do we bring and design for those kind of learning experiences and engagement and interaction to happen online, with the view that cultivating that sense of belonging really benefits students' learning and also their learning outcome as a whole. So we also know that online learning takes high level of self-regulation and self-efficacy. And so novice learners like first years struggled with that. So I think that notion of engagement and interaction we need to care for. And in terms of pedagogy, that idea of active learning and even things like the pedagogy of care, that idea of how do we design learning experiences online to be more inclusive and accessible to all students is something that we've been grappling with.
I think that's still going to be a challenge for most institutions. And my take on that is we'll probably have to go through a process where we constantly examine the feedback from our current pedagogical practices and see how we can be flexible to adopt, most importantly, the modalities of different learnings for students, and just continue that cycle of change. So now we're going to move the angle a little bit to look at AI. AI is coming into our educational technologies, and we're seeing how that's impacting how we do things and what level of knowledge we get from that. So in your opinion, how will AI and machine learning impact, inform, and support learning and teaching needs in higher education?
Yes, another good question, Chuck. And this is our favorite topic, isn't it, at the moment? Emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. And last year, I saw this attracting so much attention in higher education. And one of the indicators, and probably my title doesn't help out there in the digital world, but I never received so many emails from emerging technology companies trying to sell their next best and shiny products. And so the market is out there, and the universities are looking for more emerging technologies that allow better experience and engagement and so forth. But I think the tension exists here. You could call the utopian and dystopian views of educational technology, and especially for something like artificial intelligence. We educators and universities therefore need to be very critical of those opposing views, and so that we can evaluate those technologies and apply them for digital education for better in practice. So I certainly think that there's a healthy amount of both excitement and skepticism. So one hand is that, critics, and if you read people like Professor Neil Selwyn, their work, in most cases, those edutech don't actually work in reality in the way that they claim their technologies to be. And so that's one side of the story. And then on the other hand, you've got those advocates of edutech pushing the rhetoric of technology transforming learning and teaching for better and more exciting and more effective. So that idea of cost-saving exercise is kind of big here too. But it is the way that future is going, and it's unavoidable. So the question is, how can we progress this good work while being critical of what technology is actually doing or impacting our lives and learning and teaching practices? So we do need to work with those views. And at Deakin, so we started doing this digital learning innovation project actually this year, looking at the AI. And the idea is that it's going to help with the automated feedback processes on especially reflective writing. So we know that teachers spend a lot of time giving feedback on students' work, but we also know that there are different types of feedback that the humans and machines can give for students. And the idea is that the machine can give feedback on some of the aspects like grammar, like structural elements of written piece of work, and something like reflective writing, as long as we can provide the data as to what that standard of work looks like from the machine's perspective. So we are starting off this pilot project working with faculties at the moment to test the idea of how this automated feedback can work with artificial intelligence. But that doesn't mean to say that there haven't been already a lot of good work that's done across Australia and in this field. Especially we've been paying attention to UTS's Connected Intelligence Centre of their work looking at the automated feedback for analytical and reflective writing, and we've been learning a lot from there. But it is one of the exciting spaces and projects that we have this year.
Excellent. So I would assume that there are perceptions from academics with regards to AI coming into place. Some school of thought say that there's the thinking that it might be replacing their job, which I beg to differ. But how might your role as director influence, and I'm going to borrow one of the words you use, excite academics to uptake technology, to especially the artificial intelligence aspect of it?
Yeah, no, interesting question. And again, I think there is that healthy amount of excitement and skepticism from academics in this area. So I would say embrace that, and we need to work with that. But what I think is critical is that this is not just in the case of working with AI, but with any new technologies that higher education sector might want to implement in practice. So one is working with evidence. Wherever possible, we need to collect good evidence through the existing body of literature and research, but also looking at what we know institutionally as context and current state of the play. So something like AI, this is difficult because this is still relatively new. Not many people have engaged with it, but there are some studies done out there like UTS's work, and so we can learn from that. The other thing is about working with champions and people who understand and appreciate that value of innovation pipeline for new practice. In innovation, taking risks and sometimes even failing are inevitable. So we need to identify and create a safe environment where these new ideas can be tested, monitored, and support it. So we need to do this together, and we need to start small and build up. This is especially true if we are looking to scale up the use of that new EdTech across the university and beyond. So in a local context of one disciplinary area to the whole of university. A good way to look at this is finding that right fit, units or courses or learning contexts that have a good appetite and reason to be applying a new technology. So start small with the right people, pedagogy and technology in mind, and build iteratively and incrementally is what I would say. But of course, we always make mistakes and learn from those processes too.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've always been a huge fan of is examine the pedagogy. Pedagogy before technology, not the other way around. So I think that's basically, in addition to all the great things you also mentioned there.
Thanks for listening. This concludes part 1 of our conversation. Please join us again for part 2.